This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now today we are back to discussing Myanmar. Since the army, the Tatmadaw, seized power in a coup d'etat on February 1, anxiety over the internal situation in Myanmar has grown. A wide civil disobedience movement has seen thousands out on the streets in different forms of protest. Even some sections of the bureaucracy have joined in that. The army has responded with a show of force, cutting off the internet at night, a curfew and a continuing crackdown, with many protesters injured and hundreds arrested. On the line today, I have from Yangon, Dr. Khin Zaw Win, from New Delhi, Gautam Mukhopadhaya, and from Bangkok, Hui Yee. Good morning to you. And Dr. Khin Zaw Win, let me perhaps start with you. Let us start with the fate of the peace process with the various armed ethnic minorities that the Tatmadaw has been fighting with on and off for decades. Now, you have written recently that although State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who is under arrest again now, had continued the peace process, she is too much of a Burman majoritarian at heart and believed, similarly to the military, that autonomy for the ethnic groups could lead to secession. And now we have this coup d'etat. What effect will this have on that dynamic, the conflicts with the various ethnic groups?
It seems that you are plunging in right at the beginning. Well, it doesn't look very bright, I would say. We've had two incarnations of the peace negotiating team, and the most recent under Aung San Suu Kyi has been ditched together with the arrests and the detentions after the coup d'etat. Even before that, things were just chugging along. Everybody had really given up hope on Aung San Suu Kyi's attempts to continue the peace process. But getting to the heart of it, what you really asked, is that a lot of ethnic people also feel the same way, and I thought that I should make this comparison clear and put it on the table. It's developing more like the Burman majority versus all the ethnic nationalities. I'm Burman majority leaders. I don't mean all of us. And so the ethnics are presented with a non-choice, and it's a dismal choice. The Tampadipa version and the Aung San Suu Kyi version, there's no real difference between them. Well, having said that, Myanmar, if he's allowed to go on, which is not sure because of the protests, will have to offer a lot of concessions, and he will have to make a dogged effort to revive the peace process, because this will be the last chance for everyone. And we don't know, because things looked best under U Deng Sein when it started, and when Aung San Suu Kyi took over, she turned things upside down, so to speak. And there's a lot of fanfare to the 21st century Panlong, but it really is not getting anywhere. Well, everyone is agreed that this is our primary problem and issue in the country. And everybody wants to have a real lasting peace. But the thing is that this issue is also tied to the question of federalism. The ethnics know that when you have peace, or even before that, there has to be federalism, and federalism is closely tied to the issue of peace. But Aung San Suu Kyi is denying it and trying to separate it. I think at the heart, the main issue is that.
I see. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, we have had a predictable reaction from the international community, though slightly more informed and cautious for now, given that the aura that was constructed around Daw Suu Kyi, particularly in the West, had been tarnished by her support for the Tatmadaw's 2017 abuses against the Rohingya, which drove close to 1 million into refugee camps in Bangladesh. Now, Myanmar shares borders, of course, with Thailand, Bangladesh and China, and of course, India. And what is the view from your perspective on the situation in Myanmar and what India should or should not do? One does not hear too much about India in this situation, so I'm curious about that.
No, India has been quite forthcoming. I think in line with most of the Eastern countries, the Asian powers, they've expressed deep concern. They have expressed a desire for the release of of those detained, as well as a restoration of the democratic process and respect for the democratic process. But they have been conflicted to the extent that they haven't actually condemned it as a coup. And I think this is primarily motivated by three or four considerations. One is a kind of long-term view, that these are episodes in Myanmar history. It's necessary to keep the relationship particularly oriented towards the people going, but also primarily to keep open channels of communication, to perhaps try and talk the generals back to a kind of respect for the democratic process. But there are also other bilateral issues involved. For example, we have our security interests in the northeast of India. There is this issue of a very large Indian origin community in Myanmar that will look for solace from India. So there will be some continuity in that respect. To preserve the development projects that have been, in India's case, mostly aimed towards strengthening economic and people-to-people ties, and of course preserve some of the equities that we have actually labored to build with the Tamado over the last 30 years. And I think there would be a very important distinction for India, which is that India's sort of collaboration with the Tamado has been oriented towards basically Myanmar's defense and our security needs, and they've steered clear from the internal politics between the civil administration and the government, except in trying to make sure that the cohabitation works well. And in fact, in October, we had an unusual joint visit by the Foreign Secretary of India and the Chief of Army Staff, and the Myanmar government was comfortable enough to accept such a visit as well.
Interesting. Hui Yee, one factor very different this time around is that there is this young generation which has grown up, come of age in a decade roughly of freedom of expression, within some limits, but still quite free, political freedom and so forth. And this generation is not going to be easily cowed. We see that in the CDM, the civil disobedience movement. Tell us a little more about what is going on. How are they organizing? Which way is this heading, in your opinion?
Yes, Nirmal, these young, digitally savvy people in Myanmar were among the first to rise up against the coup. This was very clear in the initial days when NLD was still struggling to come up with a coherent response. Some of these leading activists were highly critical of Aung San Suu Kyi before the coup, but they tell me that they are fighting more for democracy rather than her per se. While they want her to be freed and the 2020 election results to be honored, they also want to go beyond that. They want to build an inclusive democracy that takes into account the needs and desires of Myanmar's ethnic minorities. So apart from getting civil servants to boycott work to try to cripple the regime, these young people have also been protesting in a way that allows them to get the attention of the wider world. The signs, for example, are in Burmese and English. And while they have learned from young protesters in Thailand and in Hong Kong, their tactics are constantly evolving. This week, for example, we saw drivers pretending their cars had broken down to block key junctions in Yangon and to stop the movement of police and soldiers.
And let me stay with you for a few seconds more, Hui Yee. What is the level, switching gears slightly, what is the level of worry in ASEAN? Are there worries about conflict and refugees, for example? Are there indications of ASEAN countries or ASEAN as an organization trying to mediate in this?
Yes, just on Wednesday, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi traveled to Brunei to see how ASEAN can come up with a better response on this issue. Brunei, as you know, is chairing ASEAN this year and has issued a statement of concern as ASEAN chair that happened on the day of the coup. Officially, there are limits to what ASEAN as a group can do because it operates by consensus of all members, including Myanmar. But as Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said earlier this week, ASEAN can play a discrete role in trying to resolve this crisis. It's still too early to talk about refugees, though there are concerns about how a military government could impact the welfare and the liberty of Myanmar people in the long term. I believe there is still room for mediation especially by parties that have not condemned the coup outright and have had a long-standing engagement with Myanmar. So ASEAN or China, for example, would probably make more headway than others if they tried to engage the regime to lower tensions and avert the tragedy.
Dr. Khin Zaw Win, two questions for you, a double-barrel question. What is your reading of where this is heading, given the CDM and the attitude of the military this time around? And the second question is, back to what Hui Yee was talking about, what can and should ASEAN, for starters, do? Anything constructive at all? So those two questions for you.
Thank you, Minerva. Well, for the first question, a lot of people believe, observers and diplomats, that Main Aung Hlaing is taking a page from General Prayut, now Prime Minister, and how he handles all the protests in Bangkok. You know? And there are indications that it might follow along that path. But will the protesters be able to stay on that long? Remember that it lasted for months in Bangkok and for a year or more in Hong Kong. You know, well, these are the two places where the most comparisons are being made. Right now, we have a kind of a balance movement is growing by leaps and bounds. Yesterday was the largest number yet. It will be very costly for Main Aung Hlaing, you know, both as politically and in lives and his image if he tries to crack down now. So he might play for time. In fact, there are indications that say that the army believes that the momentum of the protest will dissipate in a month. So they are not moving in at the moment. There are just some policemen, and they are waiting to see how long it will last. You know? If it doesn't last, or if it goes on, at some point there will be a breaking point. You know, you see the economy in Yangon and the government machinery is paralyzed. You know? The central bank has joined, and all the private banks are closed, and the staff are joining, and that's very important. People can't get their money out. You know, at least the economy is running along. You know, because we are mostly agrarian. But at some point, like I said, there could be a breaking point, and violence could erupt. For the second question, leading from the first, if that kind of tempo and momentum is increased, the best option would be a compromise and for mediators to come in. Now, I've maintained that Myanmar political culture is traditionally weak in compromise and coalitions. You know? And I don't see any people of stature and initiative who could mediate from within the country. There are some religious leaders, political leaders. I don't think so. You know? There were one or two who say they want to mediate between Aung San Suu Kyi and Main Aung Hlaing, but a lot of people are skeptical of it. There are international bodies like the United Nations, but here I think the regime, the junta, would be more inclined to accept some kind of initiative from ASEAN. In the early days of the coup, Main Aung Hlaing reached out to Prime Minister Prayut, you know, asking him for assistance in democracy building. Well, he was politely rebuffed, but I think his real purpose was to tell Prayut that, okay, I'm in your situation, please help me. You know? Well, I think they were more inclined to have a kind of intervention, if we can say that, from an ASEAN country or from ASEAN as a whole.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, there is, sticking to geopolitics, going back to geopolitics, there is this belief in some quarters that this is a new arena for US-China competition. Now, doesn't that overstate the case? How do you see the geopolitics of this panning out?
Yeah, I think somehow Myanmar has not been brought in very prominently in part of the US-China, sort of dynamics or in the Indo-Pacific dynamics. But, a little bit of a lurking shadow has been there. There was a statement by a US Charge d'Affaires some months back that kind of alluded to this. So far, I see that I think the US has to take a very strong pro-democracy stand, and I think that stand is quite popular in Myanmar at the moment. But I think this time they are likely not to use, the kind of very strong, blunt sanctions which a lot of people have opposed, which affect, in effect, the people and the economy, in particularly, the common people. So I think they're likely to use smarter sanctions, as they have shown with their first bout of sanctions. I don't think they are likely to, head towards, blanket sanctions. And also the appointment of, veteran diplomat Mr. Kurt Campbell as their special envoy for the Asia Pacific would seem to suggest that it would be a more crafted and calibrated strategy. And the fact that, the Asia Pacific is brought in, or the Indo-Pacific is brought in, would also mean that this time, the US would keep China in mind and would try to do things, as they have been warned not to do, that push the Myanmar regime that is not fundamentally inclined to go towards China, towards China.
Yes, indeed. Okay, Hui Yee, how serious, we can't say, but how serious is the Tatmadaw about the 1-year timeline? What is the thinking out there? Is the idea to sort of split the NLD, the National League for Democracy, kneecap the party so the USDP, the military party, can finally win an election?
Well, at this point, nobody is taking the Tatmadaw's words at face value. It is quite clear that Commander-in-Chief Nirmal Ghosh will not tolerate having Aung San Suu Kyi or a party back in power. So we can expect the regime to hold an election only when it is sure that the NLD would not be able to return. Now, how will he do this? Things are still unfolding, but we know that he is courting ethnic minority politicians and politicians who had fallen out with Suu Kyi before the coup. We have seen that in Rakhine State and the Arakan National Party. As for the USDP, I really doubt that they can win any fair election because they performed so poorly last year. So if the general is serious about holding an election, he will likely have to change election rules and bring together a coalition of some sort to maintain the Tatmadaw's influence in politics.
Dr. Khin Zaw Win, a parting shot from you on the same theme, the same question really. What do you see 1 year ahead politically? How do you think things will pan out?
Well, the army is meticulously following the constitution, and it stipulates that there are, in an emergency, there are 2 periods of 6 months in which the armed forces can take on emergency powers. And so it's going to be at least 1 year. If you're optimistic, as I was on this, we can expect elections maybe early next year. But this could be extended for another year if he's still not on solid ground. And so he could be on for 2 years. And yes, like we said, he doesn't want the NLD to win, or even to contest. So we are back in the days of the 1990s. And one significant development that he has mentioned is that the rules of the elections, it's not going to be first past the post anymore. He is going for proportional representation. So he has more of an excuse or rationale because this is a system that is entirely new for us and needs a lot of tutelage, and training. I myself lobbied for proportional representation in the early 2000s in Thein Sein's time, but even the ethnic MPs didn't understand it, and they were wary of it. I can tell you now, if we had proportional representation last year in last year's elections, these things will not happen. So, like you were saying, it could be a coalition, or it could be the outcome of an election with proportional representation, where there would be more even representation of the parties and ethnicities concerned. Anyway, we think that the military will be there in one form or another. Another new party could be formed, or they could form alliances with the ethnics. So 1 year or 2 year, I think we will have another elections, and I think this is really the end of the line for the NLD. To be very frank and honest, I don't think they will really bring the NLD back to power anymore.
I see. Fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Khin Zaw Win, Gautam Mukhopadhaya, Hui Yee. It's been a pleasure having you on board Asian Insider.
Thank you. Meet all of you again. It's nice being on this panel.
Take care out there. Options for the international community to really affect what is going on in Myanmar are severely limited. What the big fear is that the Myanmar economy will collapse, and that will be miserable for the people of Myanmar. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.